Hi, everybody. And give you a few minutes to let everybody jump on. We'll get going today. Everybody's having a wonderful last day of May. Hard to believe. All right. We're jumping on. I'm going to go ahead and get started and get going with our introduction here. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christy Weeks, and I'm the Brand and Digital Media Manager for Harmony Foundation. We are so grateful we're able to have this webinar series and that you all joined us today. So let's get started. Today's presentation is a conversation about revenge porn and other forms of technology facilitated sexual assault. Our presenter today is Kristen Zaleski. She is with the Mental Health Collective out of Newport Beach, California. So for those of you who are new, I want to give you a little information about Harmony. We are located on 43 acres in Estes Park, Colorado. We are right at the base of the Rocky Mountain National Park. So it's a beautiful, beautiful setting. We have over 54 years of experience treating addiction, and we are an abstinence-based program. So we have approximately 70 beds for our residential program. We do have a full medical detox. We have a virtual IOP that, of course, was in person at one point, went virtual when the pandemic hit, and it has been such a great supportive program. We've kept it virtual, and we do have a very cool option to that, which is an app that supports our IOP clients. So there will be more information about that available on the website coming soon. We also offer a family support and education program to give those families the support they need. And we have an amazing, amazing alumni support services department where we do a lot of events and keep our alumni connected in their own community as well as with Harmonies. So this is one of my favorite pictures. I had to throw this in there. This is our Swickard building, right sitting there in front of the pond. But as far as our programming, we do very much an individualized, gender-specific treatment. We are evidence-based and a 12-step program. And we offer a lifetime of support for our alumni and their family members. We think that's a very important piece of the whole foundation to recovery. If you would like to learn more information about Harmony, please visit us at harmonyfoundationinc.com. Or if you want to chat with somebody, our admission specialists are there. They'll be happy to answer any additional questions that you may have. So as we roll on, things you need to know. This webinar is definitely being recorded, and it will be accessible on our website by end of day Friday. So if you're looking to review it, it will be there. The other thing is with the CEU certificates, they will go out by end of day Friday. Please, please, please give me till the end of day Friday. Also check your junks or spam folders. My emails end up there a lot. In order to receive the certificate, you must be involved in the webinar for at least 45 minutes. And I do have a tracking program that keeps track of the time that you're involved. If by chance you happen to call in with a phone number versus the email that you registered with, please shoot me an email and let me know. I will put it in the chat box a little bit later so I can identify you and make sure you get your certificate. There is a survey that will be coming. Some of you generally catch it at the end of the webinar. If you happen to miss that, don't worry. I will include it in your email. It is not required to receive your CE, but we really do appreciate your feedback. So if you could fill that out for us, we would appreciate it. Today's presenter, I already briefly introduced her. I do have her bio all set up right here. I am not going to read it because she's going to do a fabulous job of introducing herself. This bio is available, will be available on our website if you want to read more about her. So we do want to say thank you to the Mental Health Collective in Newport Beach for their continued partnership. It is so important to keep treatment partners. And if you want to learn more about them, please check out their website. It's the mhcollective.com. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Zaleski. So one moment and you can share yours. We'll be ready to
Hey,
go.
everybody. Thanks for coming, and thank you, Christy, for this is really quite a organized and big thing to do. So I just want to thank you for your leadership and organization and making all this happen.
Of course.
So Christy and I are going to work together with your chat. I'm going to pause multiple times throughout this talk. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a minute, but I taught at USC for a decade. There's such a thing I believe in called death by PowerPoint. That is not my intent here. I really think that this kind of a presentation with all of you on the ground, working with clients, and probably if you don't realize it, you've probably had at least one, if not multiple cases of technology facilitated abuse and sexual assault. So I really just want to be a resource to all of you. And number one, understanding this. Some of you are coming to this talk and understand it, and I will have slides for you a little bit after I just explain the basics of what this is and how to look at it. So feel free to write in the chat, and Christy will let me know if there's a bunch of questions all of a sudden. And like I said, I will take some pausing as well. Let me just get set up here. Okay, so here's my goal for today. Generally, what is image-based sexual abuse? How that can create a trauma response. There is some controversy around that for clinicians, and I want to get into that a little bit, especially to help you conceptualize what you're seeing in your clients, and also talk about if, you know, sharing sexual images is ever a good thing, and what the research says about healthy development and how we navigate sexual conversations online, which is obviously only becoming more and more prominent. So the little bit about me I want to say that brings me to this. So I'm over 2 decades now as a social worker in Los Angeles. I have both a master's and a PhD in social work. I was a full-time faculty member, a clinical associate professor at the University of Southern California School of Social Work for a decade. Before that, I had spent another decade at the Veterans Administration or UCLA's Rape Treatment Center, all based around sexual assault, sexual trauma. So my area of expertise is a clinician and a researcher around trauma. And so that's really how I found my way here, specifically sexual assault. I started seeing this in my clinical room, at least conceptualizing what this was in the forensic setting. We would start noticing that people who were coming in for rape kits were also having a conversation around digital images and vulnerability and exposure. And I watched firsthand that police didn't really know what to do with that, and neither did we as evidence, people who collect evidence in a forensic setting. In a therapy room, I have many stories. I just had an article in Politico last week and the Washington Post a few weeks earlier, where I was talking about some of my clients and what this looks like in a therapy room. And in addition to that, I'm also a consultant for Meta, what used to be known as Facebook. I meet with them every year. I'm on the Global Safety Task Force. We meet as a global advocate network to talk about what we're seeing in each country, and really interesting and terrible stories are coming out of that. And I also am a published author. I have research on sexual trauma as well as 2 published books, one on military specific sexual trauma and more general trauma across the lifespan and globally. So that's just a little bit about me and how I come to this work. I also just want to acknowledge the language I'm using when I talk about this, okay? From a forensic place, when we're talking about a crime, I've been trained to refer to that person as a victim. When we're talking about therapy, when we're talking about overcoming a trauma, we're talking about a survivor. That tends to be how the literature is written as well. So I just want to acknowledge, for those of you who are sensitive to the word victim, my training tends to be, when I'm talking about a crime, I'm talking about victimization. I'll also use the term perpetrator, accused, assailant. And the other piece that I think is really important as we get into the constructs of gender is there is some research I'm going to go over with the category of non-binary, but for the majority of sexual trauma research, it's really through a heteronormative lens. And so there is a male-female conversation. I will keep mentioning that as I go over some of the data points, but just want to acknowledge that I'm trying to include as much as I can as other constructs come online in the research around it. So I'm going to take a break to get questions in 2 more slides, so feel free to put questions in the chat. But just to sort of overview what I'm talking about. I'm talking about image-based sexual abuse. So that's sort of a big umbrella, okay? The definition there is in the left. We're talking about the taking and the creation of intimate images. I'm going to get into a few more details of how that creation piece can happen when we're talking about victimizing someone, and then distributing those, often paired with threats, okay? So there's lots of terms. Revenge porn is the most popular. As researchers and academics and therapists, we don't like that term because it's not pornography. When we talk about pornography, there tends to be consent in the release of that video or image, and this is revenge pornography. This is an image that might have been shared with my boyfriend out of a trusting, loving, intimate relationship, and my partner gets upset with me, we break up, and my partner uses that image I consensually shared with him to now deface me, humiliate me, violate me, get me fired, other things. Okay, so that's the idea of revenge porn. And so we don't like that word porn because of that implication of consent, which of course no one's consenting to these things. As artificial intelligence has become more and more prominent in our news, we're talking a lot more about how AI has a direct effect into this victimization and crime. And then there's things like upskirting, where people are purposefully putting cameras on the lower part of ground in subway stations, and there's websites dedicated to sort of upskirting, having images up skirts and looking at genitalia. Various forms of cybercrime, which can intersect all these things I've talked about, and then this idea of sextortion, which is extortion through image-based sexual abuse. So just taking a break here, I'm going to get into more definitions of some of these things, but I want to check out the chat. I see lots of people saying hello. Okay, great. So no questions yet, but please write any questions if you have any. So continuing on. So what is a deep fake? A deep fake is a fancy term for stealing someone's image and superimposing it onto a video where it looks like that person has engaged in that sexual act, okay? So this happens a lot in politics. If you remember the Hillary Trump election, there were lots of videos of them talking and speaking and saying things that were just outrageous and not true. People who had really well educated technological minds were able to find 50 images of Hillary Clinton and 50 images of Donald Trump in all different versions, angles, scenarios, and so they can then have the computer learn what that image looks like and then start shaping conversations and things. AI can also hear voices from videos of lectures or speeches and then create words from what it's learned on how that voice goes. So that used to be in the 2008 election, the 2016 election, that used to be something that was pretty easy to do with people who had the savviness, right, and their tech ability. Now, today, we are seeing this at alarming rates because there are free apps that you can download. Now you don't need to be tech savvy at all. You just need to be able to have enough photos to upload it into an app and create a pornographic image. The downside to this, of course, is people who aren't familiar with what the concept of a deep fake is, and frankly, it looks so good now. It used to look fake. It doesn't look as fake as it used to, that people believe the videos are true. And we're watching more and more people lose jobs, have to move out of their town, really be violated and victimized because of these fake videos, okay? The other key thing about this is photographs used to be widely available to people who took them of each other, right? But now with more and more posting on the internet, you don't even need to take these pictures in real time of someone anymore. You can just get onto their Instagram, download all the selfies they've taken, and then create something like this. So we're able to see these crimes be even less contact than they had to be before. And if you read this slide, you see there's some examples here of things we've seen with celebrities and in the public where this has been happening. Sextortion is a layer of this. It's where people are extorted for money based on a photograph that someone has taken without consent or created. You might remember Amazon's owner, Jeff Bezos, being extorted by the National Enquirer a few years ago. And to those threats, he allegedly was being threatened, and so just came out to the public with the photographs of the affair he was having, rather than someone expose that. These are two recent incidences you can see this year where we're watching it enter adolescent bullying situations, and kids who might see that they might not know the person, but they see that they're friends with other friends, start to chat with them, maybe engage with coercion on some sex act. And then that person immediately sends to that 15-year-old, I have that photo, you need to send me $500 or I'm going to tell your parents. And some really bad cases of abuse and mental health and suicide as a result of that. We're also watching this be used as a form of political action. We had a local politician in California who resigned from office shortly after she was elected because her ex-husband had posted photographs that were real, that they had taken together, that involved not normal sexual behavior. And so he did that as a way to ruin her career, and she resigned as a result of it. In Azerbaijan right now, we allegedly are hearing that the government is using pictures that they're taking of protesters, particularly female protesters that are speaking out against the government, and releasing images that are a product of AI or not actual real to them. And there was a really famous case in the Marine Corps in 2017. There were a number of congressional hearings that followed where there was a Facebook group, a messenger group specifically. And this is something I can tell you by being on that global safety task force. When you are in an encrypted group like Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, there's advantages to that in terms of like global politics, right? People can organize and revolt and do things that in some eyes might be a good thing, in the name of democracy or freedom. But on the flip side, it can also be used as a way to inflict harm and violence. And so when they're encrypted, when they're private group chats, they truly are that. Even the companies like Meta cannot go into those group chats unless they're invited in to see what's there. So these can be big joining groups where we have seen a lot of abuse, particularly around image-based sexual assault happening. So last slide here, until I get into some more details about who we're seeing are the assailants, is just the various terms you might have heard. This is just a page of all the different names we have in the literature. We as a global society talking about this are still arguing on what to call it. I personally prefer technology facilitated sexual violence, but it seems like American researchers are sort of trying to come together and say image-based sexual assault. So that's where I'm at when I talk to audiences like you, or I talk to the press, I'm using revenge porn because that's what we know as a society. But any of these terms that you might have heard are all the same thing. We're just all trying to figure out what we call this thing. Okay, so pausing, and I would really love your questions, comments, or thoughts on this as a phenomenon, anything I wasn't clear on, and I'll just give you a second to type anything in if there is anything. So Jolene, that's a really good question. And the military is, Diane, that's a great question. I have a slide I'm going to show you in just a minute with that answer. So the military question. So the military is trying to understand what's happening. My personal hope for the military is that they start to see this as a form of sexual violence. The military currently sees this as a form of domestic violence, which it absolutely is. For those of you familiar with like the wheel of violence, you know, there's financial abuse, there's physical abuse, there's, you know, physical separation, right? There's all these different categories. A lot of people are advocating in the domestic violence world to add digital abuse in there, particularly around this topic, because we're seeing it more and more. There's a great research study published 2 years ago by a woman named Asia Eaton in Florida, who actually looked at a few years worth of newspaper articles around domestic violence and went into the details of each domestic violence crime that made the news. And the majority of them had sexual violence through images included. It is a tactic that's happening more and more. So the military sees that, but they aren't recognizing it as a separate issue of sexual violence. Why does this matter to me? It matters because they put out a national report every year. I actually did not catch this year's. It should have been released in April, and I have yet to look at it. So maybe they included it this year, and if anybody knows, let me know. But in past years, they have not specifically called out image-based sexual assault as something they're keeping track of. And in the military, regardless of if you're discharged honorably or not, if you were sexually assaulted during military service, you are eligible for free psychotherapy for your lifetime, right? So even if you have a dishonorable discharge, you can get free therapy around that sexual trauma that occurred during military service time. As I have spoken to some local people that work at VAs, I've asked them specifically if someone had an image shared, which I consider sexual violence, which in the therapy room looks like sexual violence does look, to me it's the same. Can they get free therapy at the VA? No one has been able to say that they are offering that. They're recognizing that as that contingency. So I think we have a lot more to do in the military around it. They now have a required course they have for many years around sexual violence. In some of those courses, they have included this, and some they haven't. So they're working on it, but they certainly could be better. Catherine, I love your question too. And I think you will see that I'm going to say, no, we shouldn't all leave social media, especially some of us who are in minority groups. I want to get into that a little bit more towards the end. And these are great questions. Please keep them coming. So for those of you who are Netflix people, you might have seen a documentary that won some awards called The Most Hated Man on the Internet. Hunter Moore is credited, whatever that means, as sort of the first celebrity revenge porn assailant. He created a website about 10 years ago called Is Anybody Up? And encouraged the posting of non-consensual images of people's partners, unclothed and unknown, that they were being taken to be shared. And it was sort of this frontline viewing and ridicule site. He went to prison for that website and the acts involved in that website. But he's back now and just as loud as ever. And that speaks to some of the consent and legal issues we have globally around this topic, which I'll get at towards the end. So a lot of people want to know who's doing this. How common is this? So that's where this slide goes. And all my references are on the bottom of my slide, and I can share my references if you want them. I'm not going to share my slides, but I can share my references. So a study just published last year, UK, Australia, New Zealand. I want to call those countries out, by the way. The United States is really behind those three in how we look at this and how we create federal money to protect against it. Australia has an entire federal office protecting against digital violence and has for many years. So their researchers are much more advanced and they have more funding to do these sorts of studies. But you're looking at, out of their sample of 6,000 people, we're looking at 1 in 3 that have actually acknowledged taking non-consensual images and distributed them. The 1 in 10 people know they are distributing them without consent. Demands are a common thing people are admitting to. And this last point here is a point around sexual violence generally. And I think it's so important when we talk about digital sexual violence to link it to face-to-face sexual violence, because people try to separate them and they're not separate. They really look the same. Men tend to perpetrate sexual violence, whether in the digital realm or in person, more often than women, but men and women equally are victims. Going back to the military, this is true in the military too. Statistically, women are a smaller group in the military, so they look like they have higher statistics. But when you look at raw numbers of victimization and military sexual trauma or civilian sexual trauma, men and women tend to have equal distributions, and that's also true here. Go ahead, Christy, tell me when we have.
I felt like this was pretty relevant. Randy's asked, are these numbers weighted towards people under 30?
Yeah, so I'm going to go into, I think I have a slide on ages, but I want to ask you now, or I want to answer that now. This is for adults, and we have, let me see if it's on the next slide. No, and we have, I'm going to go over some minor studies too. But for the most part, the most active group also is in line with face-to-face sexual violence. We're looking at 18 to 25, something like that. But the second most common group are people over 55. Okay, I really want to be clear about that. Yes, it is a young people thing, and it is an over 55 thing. And for those of you who are in that age demographic, I just want you to think about it and talk with your friends. How many of them have shared sexy photographs with their partner? It is a thing that is pretty normal, and we are watching sexual violence from that group.
Wow,
Christy,
that statistic just got me, made my mouth drop open. I figured why we have you here there. Lisa was asking, are these videos posted on the dark web, or is there a list of websites? And do you advise people to know these sites and look at them in case they've been recorded without knowledge?
Yeah, so, and Jet, I just want to acknowledge, I'll try to read these questions. Sorry that I had not done that before. So there is a dark web, right, where these things are shared. Pornhub just was sort of forced because of an advocacy initiative where credit card companies started, they were getting pressure from their constituents to take their credit card off of Pornhub unless Pornhub would do something about these images being posted every day by the thousands. There are many research articles that just study Pornhub and the amount of non-consensual videos and images there are on there. And so Pornhub has started to do something and take down with request. The dark web's a whole different issue, and it absolutely is there. You often have to show up with a non-consensual image to be let into some of those dark web groups. That being said, these studies, none of them I'm presenting today are on the dark web. They're on front-facing social media sites and understanding how people experience their victimization. So I'll go into those too. So Jolene, you're saying, what is the explanation for the 55 plus perpetrators? Their brains are fully formed long before then. I think I don't know that answer for sure, but I think you're asking me with some expertise here. In my clients that I sit in therapy rooms with, there is a sexual conversation happening online. There is sexting, there is FaceTiming. Sometimes people get a little sexy during their FaceTime, and all you need is someone to take a screenshot of that FaceTime, and they now have an image you did not consent to them taking that they can share, right? So I think about sort of the sexual dialogue and the flirtation that is starting to happen more and more as we go digital. And the sex lives of 55 plus are just as active as some of our young adults too, especially after menopause for women. We can have a resurgence of renewed interest, and so I really want to normalize that and try to spread the word on how we keep each other safe, right? And I'll talk more about that too. These are great questions. So this is an older study, but I think people always find it interesting. It shows, this was with college students, and it shows sort of, if you don't mind me saying, some of the cluelessness behind the sharing. They talked to 159 people who did acknowledge they have sent images without consent of the person. And they asked where. Most at that time, this was pre-COVID, was by text. Showing people in person, like in class, on social media. And then what was the reason? The top reason was, I didn't want to hurt them. I was just showing my friend, this hot person sent me this photograph. I wanted to show them this hot person, kind of thing. So there is that piece, that cluelessness, if you will, of sharing. But then there were some that did acknowledge, no, I didn't hurt them. I did it to ruin their reputation. So who are the victims? So again, this goes back to your question before. We're looking at, 18 to 40. What is that? 43%. When we're looking at 41 and over, we're looking at 57%. Christy, I hope your mouth is dropping again. This is just the fact. This is a study from 2022. Okay. So this is recent published research. We really sort of, I think, unfairly say kids these days, but it's not, right? And I think about this with sexually transmitted disease research too. There is a phenomenon of chlamydia and other things happening in retirement homes, right? Like, I think having a conversation about healthy sexuality is always important here. Women have a bit higher rates of victimization, but going back to that raw data in numbers, they tend to be the same. When we get into more marginalized groups, LGBTQ have higher rates of abuse online, and people who identify as part of a minority group. That's racial and gender minority, as well as people with disabilities who tend to find each other online because they can't necessarily recognize people that they feel are alike in their school or their workplace. So I'm talking about the neurodivergent community, people with physical disabilities, those places as well. I'm seeing a question. Yeah, Randy, I do think there's an education piece. He was saying that over 50s might have more naivete. But I would say everyone does. I'm raising a 13-year-old, and the amount of things I'm starting to see in 7th grade, and when I talk to parents about it, they're clueless, right? And those parents range, between 30 and 50 years old, and the kids aren't really being parented to think about these things. And so the kids don't know. So it's like everyone's kind of clueless, and even in the sexual violence community with my colleagues, there's a number that haven't recognized this. So I think we're all just trying to find our way. And so this goes to the dark web question: where was the image shared? Social media friends tend to be the biggest cohort, study after study. Sometimes you hear some really angry ones around, tagging family members, tagging the workplace, things like that, with the intent to get that person fired. And it has worked. There's a number of elementary school teachers, for example, that have lost jobs because the community has believed these pictures to be true, especially when it's AI videos, and their lives are ruined, and they have to move and change their life. In a study I did, I haven't published this yet, but we were curious about how much of someone's body part was in it. I don't mean to be vulgar, but there's a phenomenon of DPs or dick pics that happened. And the question we were having was, if there's no recognizable thing but a genital, and that gets shared, but there's no face, there's no tattoo, there's no scar, nothing that would sort of have somebody recognize that was a person outside of that genital, is that as traumatic for someone when they find out it's been shared as like a full frontal, right? Does that make sense? And so what were you thinking, Christy?
So I only say this because there's somebody that we know that their son at 19, 20 years old, having a conversation with an unknown person and said, hey, send me a picture. So he did, and then immediately got the sextortion.
Yes.
You need to pay me, or I'm sending this to all of your contacts.
Yes.
All of your family's contacts, because everybody's connected. They have easy access to all that. And it was the most frightening, embarrassing thing. And there really wasn't a course of action for it. Call the police, and they're like, well, your best bet is to just say no. Go ahead, send the picture, because they're going to get bored asking you. Fortunately, that worked, but I don't think that's the case.
And so I think what I'm hearing too is it was just genitals with no identifiable stuff,
Face.
Right?
Face
Both. Too. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that becomes really scary. And what happened to your friend is something that I've seen go both ways. You can't just say no, 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 no. And the person, that is in it for money might just give up. Correct. I had a client recently who that happened to, did not give money to the person and did publish. And now you can't Google her name without seeing those images. And the terrible thing is it's technically child porn because those images were taken when she was 17, and she's hired an attorney. We've contacted the FBI, we've contacted our congressperson, and there's just not a lot you can do. Little websites like eBay will remove them with time. Meta will remove them with time. But like in Meta's case, you actually have to send them the intimate image. They have to scan that. Other people have to look at it for them to then find it and remove it, right? So there's still a bit of humiliation that happens with this, but it's hard. Once it's there, it won't come down.
Correct. Wow.
Thank you for sharing that story. Okay, so in the research that I've yet to publish, we did find that to be true. The more you could recognize somebody, the higher levels of PTSD that they reported. Okay, so that's adults, right? So now I just want to talk briefly about adolescents and what the research is showing. So when we talk about adolescents, there's two things to know about this data. One is it's mostly sexting, the phenomenon of sexting, right? So sending a naked photograph to someone by text, and then, or an intimate photograph. And it's also done with seniors or freshmen college who are looking back at their adolescent life, because under 18 is such a specialized group. It's hard to get approval to study them, especially around things like this. So that what they do is they interview 18-year-olds about their high school or middle school experience. So they're like retrospective, okay? So in this study, we're looking at almost 6% that, and you know what? I should have put what the sample size was. I remember it being quite large, like almost in the 10,000 range. Almost 6%, okay, had sex online in the last year, okay. A non-binary category was in this study, and we found that to be higher, and then boys, and then girls, okay, in terms of who reported to have online sex. So non-binary identified, then boys, then girls. About 10%, and I think this is really important, 10% of those that acknowledged it said they felt persuaded or coerced, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about healthy sexual identity. And the other piece, which may or may not be, news for everyone here, I think for the trauma therapists, it's not, that there was a correlation with adolescents who had actually had real life sexual victimization, also being victimized online. The other interesting thing about this study is what we know about parental relationships. When they were asked about their relationships with their parents, they tended to report poorer relationships. But the other key here, and again, I can send you my references if you want to read about it, is that they were more overprotective with less parental care. So these people who were interviewed said their parents were overprotective than the ones who had sex online but had not been abused. Now, here's the surprise to this study, and I'm curious about people's reactions, but that the majority of adolescents, who had sexual experiences online, did not report it to be abusive or detrimental. This was particularly true when it was, they're 17 and the person they're talking to is 17, right? Not a 42-year-old, but when they're the same age or slightly older. And so I put this quote at the bottom, I'm just going to read. Participants often expressed that they had initially been excited and they were sometimes part of inciting the sexual activity. Considering that sexual curiosity is a significant aspect of development and that digital advances have led many young people to explore their sexuality online, this initial excitement is not a deviating trait. It's the offenders that take advantage of children's natural curiosity that seems to be the most impactful, particularly around self-blame. Okay, and I want to show one more slide before I take comments, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments there. There's an article out of the UK that studied British schooling and adolescents sharing intimate images. And she really saw it, I thought, in this nice developmental trajectory. And I want you all, especially, I'm 44, I'm sort of out of the Polaroid generation, but they did exist a little bit. I want to acknowledge there were exchanging of sexy images, right, in my high school through sort of one-off pictures, right? And I imagine this phenomenon would have existed in my high school if we had cellular phones and digital images. So I don't think that this is unique to adolescents at using images to share sexual agency. I mean, think about, the paintings we see of teenagers and young 20s when we go into museums from hundreds of years ago, right? This idea of photographing sex and sexuality is not new. What's new is how rapid it can share, and the social media piece of how rapid other people can view it and make copies of it, right? You couldn't copy a Polaroid, right? It was harder. So that's really, I think, the shift here. And so this article talks about how there's this spectrum. There's this purposeful sexualization of children, which is wrong and awful. And we all, have seen the worst of that. But on the other side is the healthy sexual agency, right? And how when we start talking to kids or our over 55 crew, having people understand what is healthy and how to keep those boundaries healthy and curious and normal and part of finding yourself in a sexual view versus being taken advantage of and abused, right? And in the middle, what we tend to do, and this is true in face-to-face sexual violence too, is victim blame, right? When people report this, it's why did you take that picture, right? Why did you send that to your partner? Instead of why would this person think that they could post this everywhere? Why would that person want to harm you, right? That's the place we should be putting our energy, but instead it's usually around the victim blame around it. And that's true, as we know, with like gendered discussions of face-to-face sexual violence, what they were wearing, how intoxicated they were, regardless of those things, that person shouldn't have raped them, right? But where we focus makes a difference in long-term healing of trauma. Okay, so I don't see any, I can pause if anybody wants me to. I don't see anything in the chat, and I'm running out of time. So I just want to go over trauma really quick and what we know in the literature. Okay, so we're starting to identify it. Sweden was the first country in 2018 that actually successfully prosecuted somebody for revenge porn of a child. Okay, we know that these trauma symptoms look the same. We particularly know, going back to what I just mentioned about how we victim blame, self-blame is the hardest and most prominent thing in PTSD when we look at these with children. Okay, they're blaming themselves and how they got into this. And when we have parents who don't know how to teach their kids to present it and navigate it, and law enforcement agencies and teachers who don't necessarily have it on their radar, it's really unfair, right? That there's so much self-blame when there was no education and conversation around it to begin with. But we're looking at the same sort of things you would expect with childhood sexual assault, suicidal behavior, self-harm, sleeping problems, trust issues, those sorts of things. We know that depression and anxiety is much higher in people who report this kind of crime. There's unique forms of social anxiety we're beginning to see, where people completely leave the internet. You know, this is particularly problematic for therapists and psychiatrists right now. When someone's been sexually violated online, they don't want to be on video at all, some of them. And so they can't participate in telehealth, right? And so finding a provider, especially if you're living, you know, in a country town or somewhere more remote, that you're not in a big city, it's harder to gain access to care if you have that kind of phobia of being online. We're also noticing a lot more body-based symptoms in people with this sort of crime. And so all these nuances need to be paid attention to. This is a nerdy slide, but I think I'm going to end here. I think it's really important that, going back to what we were saying before, in a face-to-face sexual assault or domestic violence situation, there can come a point where the assault ends, right? There's a start point and an end point. And what I do as a therapist in the room when I start to do trauma therapy around rape is I start with, when did you know you were safe? When did you know it was over? You know, those stories are usually the next day, the day after, when they get home, when they lock their door, after they take a shower, after they leave the hospital of a rape kit, after they report to the police, then they start to feel more safe. What I'm asking is, on this slide, when their body starts to leave that fight or flight place and go back to exhaustion, right? Exhaustion brings us back to homeostasis after a traumatic event. So if you even think of being rear-ended, there's a moment where your nervous system escalates, you feel yourself in that fight or flight response. And then when you're home, or your car is taken care of, or you know you don't have any long-term symptoms, you start to feel really tired and you sleep. That's a natural way for the human body to recover after any big deal, even positive. You know, there's lots of graduations right now. People will come back and sleep for a day. It's exhausting, right? So that's just how our nervous system's organized. The issue with digital sexual violence is there is no ending. This story you told, Christy, it sounds like this picture was never shared. There was an ending for that person, so that's good. For the people who have pictures shared, it doesn't matter who shared them originally. People copy them and share them to other websites. And so that becomes the problem, is the long-term manifestation of chronic stress in these experiences, okay? And as a therapist, that's the hardest part to treat, because it's like they're being victimized every day. I mean, the stories that I've heard, for instance, the one I just mentioned, where she's, you know, out of college looking for a job now, and employers Google her and see her naked 17-year-old body. I'm sure that impacts how she's getting jobs. I have another client who did a video consensually with a partner whom she was married to. The divorce was bad. The person shared that video, and it's now online in perpetuity. And as her son has grown up and perhaps consuming online, she's had to warn him that she has a video out there of her mother, right? So these are terrible situations and conversations that survivors are starting to have. The New York Times did a terrible story about a father who took pictures of his young child, and she did not know that had happened. They had sort of shielded her from that. Her father was prosecuted and put in prison, but now as an adult, she needs to know that those photos are still showing up online all the time, right? And child pornography sites. There are terrible stories. And what that does to a nervous system, can you ever find safety? Can you ever feel like it's over? For some, but not for all the clients I've worked with. And so I am starting to try to wrap my head around how I treat someone and teach somebody coping skills and regulation strategies that are healthy when they constantly feel like their body is being on display and they are being victimized in a regular way. So there's no studies that exist on image-based sexual assault right now for therapy, but we're hoping that some happen more. If you have this kind of client, my advice on how you treat it is the self-blame. They have for sure felt blamed in the media and maybe in their personal life. And so going back to, can they be online? I think being online is a supportive place if you find those supportive websites and sharing sites. There used to be this wonderful Twitter group. They just banned it a few years ago, but they were all revenge porn survivors. And so when they would get word of someone's image being shared on Twitter, they would send out an alert and all the army would come and just like bomb that person's Twitter page so that that image would just go down, 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 and make it less likely to be seen. And that sort of like peer support, right, is really important for survivors. So helping them find a community, which might be an online community. I also think, and this is part of the advocacy piece, having survivors talk to their elected officials and making a police report. As a therapist, I've had to educate police officer after police officer about the law of California and how what my client is reporting is a crime. I think California is getting better at providing that awareness to officers on the front line, but I think we as an advocacy group can do that a little better too. But I'm just going to skip the rest of these slides and put my contact information here and allow any more conversation, questions, comments with the few minutes that we have. I'm really happy to answer any questions that are coming.
Asking you shall receive.
Okay, so could there be any legal consequences? The one thing I want to say is every state has a different law, and there are some states that don't have any laws. There are some states that only have it as a misdemeanor and then others that are felonies. The difficulty that we have found, and until there's a federal mandate that is much more explicit in language, what states tend to do, the language tends to be the intent to harm, right? That they distribute it without consent and the intent to harm. So here's the two issues. One, in some states, if I took a photograph of you naked, I own that image. So I can then share it as much as I want, right? So it then does not become non-consensual because I'm the owner of that image, even though it's of your naked body. And then the intent to harm, that has to be proven in a court of law. And a lot of district attorneys do not take that case because it's a very hard thing to prove. So we are not seeing these cases get the success rate that you would want in court. The laws in Colorado, I don't know. You will not have access to the slides, but I'm happy to send my references. And there's the if you just Google revenge porn Colorado, you will get websites that come up. Again, the term image-based sex abuse doesn't have as much on Google, but if you do revenge porn and then your state, that will come up.
And if you do want to revisit the slide deck, like I said, it will be on our website by Friday, this entire presentation. So you will have access to that.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for your positive words. I think I've hit
Yes.
everyone's questions. Are there any others?
It looks like I'll kind of keep an eye on there. I just want to give, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Zaleski. This was amazing. I literally, I was stunned at the statistics. And I keep circling back to the older population, just not being aware of how intricate and how deep social media and how it actually functions, because, you know, we all experience parents that are like, what? Well, I'm just having a conversation with so-and-so. No, you're having a conversation with everybody.
Yeah.
So that was terribly surprising to me. But for everybody that's
you
still
have something
here,
fun to talk about when you go out with friends this weekend. Everybody talk to their friends.
Icebreaker conversation.
See if they're sending intimate images.
Right. So everybody, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I learned a lot. Definitely far more aware and vigilant of what's out there. We'll be having conversations with my 20 to 24-year-old children very soon. So next month, we do have Kevin Peterson with the Chronic Hope Institute presenting on working with families that are struggling with addiction and codependency. So stay tuned. That link for registration will be in your email with your certificate. Again, just a reminder, it'll be there by end of day Friday. Check your junk email. That's where I like to sit, is in the junk emails. But reach out to me if you need anything or you don't see it by Monday morning. I hope we get you back someday. I hope
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for listening.
Absolutely. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for supporting the Harmony Professional Webinar Series, and we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.